If you've been following the channel for a while, you undoubtedly learned a few things about me. One is that I have a passion for game preservation and narrative design. 2 is that I never cut my hair. And 3 is that I'm a huge fan of Metal Gear. I've made multiple videos highlighting the series, and even when the game I'm talking about has nothing to do with Metal Gear, I'm still obligated to reference it at least twice a video. Metal Gear Solid might be my favorite series of all time, with Snake Eater possibly being one of my favorite games of all time. That's why it's strange that I've never looked at the games in their entirety. I've talked about parts and sections and why those moments are important, but I've never taken the time to talk about the entire game's design, stories, and discuss how important they are. And I think I kept you waiting long enough. So today, we're finally taking an in-depth look at the series. And what better way to start than looking at the greatest entry in the series? It was not only considered to be one of the best games on the console, but it is critically rated as one of the best games of all time. This is Sobriety Check, and today we're taking a look at Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color. For some of you, this might be the first time that you even heard that there was a Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color. When it comes to the Metal Gear franchise, it isn't a game that's often mentioned. To be clear, this isn't some bootleg demake of Hideo Kojima's PlayStation masterpiece. Instead, this was an entirely new game, though you quickly learn that it has nothing to do with the PlayStation title with the same name. It's a little less confusing in Japan, with the full title being Metal Gear Ghost Babel, or Metal Gear GB, aka Metal Gear for the Game Boy. When you do hear it being mentioned, it's often in the same breath as the other weird Metal Gear spin-offs, such as Metal Gear Acid or VR Missions. It's a non-canonical entry into the series that only existed because a certain publisher wanted to milk a little bit more out of a successful franchise. That company's marketing division in Europe determined that a handheld title would sell. In fact, the reason it's called Metal Gear Solid despite having nothing to do with the Solid series was because they thought they could sell more copies if people associated it with the PlayStation game. And it worked. When the game released on April 24th in the year 2000, I got it thinking I would have a portable version of one of my favorite games at the time. This is the copy I bought on launch day. Needless to say, I was initially disappointed. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who overlooked it because of that. But even more unusual is how it's even ignored by the series itself. Metal Gear Solid has always been a series that's self-referential. Even starting with the PlayStation, MGS was talking about Gray Fox and Outer Heaven, as if everyone had somehow played the original titles. Yet any reference to Ghost Babel is conspicuously absent in the series. Outside of a few Easter eggs, it's often disregarded entirely, which I understand because it's decidedly non-canon. But Ghost Babel isn't even acknowledged as a footnote in the series' legacy. Seriously, this is the treatment it gets in the celebration of the series found in Ground Zero's Deja Vu mission.
What? I don't think I remember that one.
The most the series was ever acknowledged was in the crazy AI section of Sons of Liberty, which was released shortly after Ghost Babel. If Ghost Babel was a black mark on the series, I could understand why. But I wasn't lying when I said this game is critically the best in the series. According to the review aggregate site Game Rankings, it reviewed better than any other game in the series, and overall it's in the top 50 games of all time, right alongside games such as The Last of Us and Chrono Trigger. Even going past the inherent flaws of using aggregate reviews, it is still considered one of the best Game Boy Color games by many. The existence of Ghost Babel leaves us with a lot of questions. What was so good about it? Is it really one of the best Metal Gear games? And if so, why was it ignored? I think it's time we look for some answers. Let's give Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color the sobriety check. Before we talk about the game, let's talk about the Game Boy Color briefly. The GBC was released in November 1998 to replace the venerable Game Boy. It featured a slightly faster processor, more onboard RAM, and a 16-bit color palette among a few other improvements. But it was by no means a powerful console. Instead, the focus was on a more practical handheld with a longer battery life and backwards compatibility with the Game Boy's library. It's often regarded as a slightly more powerful NES in terms of capability. However, that's not to say you couldn't do much with it. There are some games that did incredible things with the hardware, and major props to the programmers and designers who managed to spin gold from straw. A lot of these games weren't what you would call great, though. The Game Boy Color was pretty infamous for companies trying to retrofit games on the hardware with varying degrees of success. The console simply wasn't powerful enough to accomplish what they wanted. Concessions usually had to be made to get it to work on the hardware, which led to games like Donkey Kong Country looking like a hot mess of pixels. Even if they weren't just straight up ports, and instead were games designed specifically for the hardware, there were often problems. For example, Capcom tried to make Resident Evil work on a handheld with Resident Evil Gaiden. But no doubt while it was an ambitious undertaking, even the most generous critic would admit that there were some issues. So how does Metal Gear Solid... you know what, let's just stick with Ghost Babel to avoid any confusion. So how does Metal Gear Ghost Babel handle this? Well, the answer isn't all that surprising if you think about it. Metal Gear started as a 2D game series, so all Ghost Babel had to do is return to the series' roots. It had been 10 years since there was a 2D Metal Gear game. So, in some ways, Ghost Babel was one of gaming's first retro revivals. The idea of bringing back a series to its original gameplay. While incredibly common now, back then there wasn't an outcry of fans wanting something like, say, a Classicvania because they were too busy complaining about Castlevania not being 3D yet. If only they had known. But despite Ghost Babel returning to 2D, they included gameplay mechanics found in Solid, including crawling, the Soliton radar, being able to press yourself against walls and distract guards. If you haven't played the original games and just come here from Metal Gear Solid, it feels almost exactly like it does on the PlayStation. Though, really a lot of these features were still over a decade old. Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake included a lot of these mechanics already. However, in the West we got Snake's Revenge, so pretty much anything would seem like an improvement. Regardless, these inclusions made Ghost Babel feel like a natural evolution in the series. It wasn't just game mechanics either, nearly every aspect of Ghost Babel improves upon the original games. Level design tends to be much better. There's still plenty of boxes strewn about and maze-like corridors, and there's still a lot of backtracking. I mean, this is a Metal Gear game, though levels do a good job at being designed with a natural flow without being linear. Enemy placement is also much better. For one, you'll never transition to a screen where you're automatically caught, and their patrols are set so you can always sneak around them without having to kill them. It makes a pacifist no-alert run completely viable, which is something that's difficult to say about the original games. Ghost Babel also does an excellent job at varying its gameplay, with each section giving you different mechanics to explore. For example, in one of the chapters, your goal is to head to the middle of the base to meet with someone, and in order to talk to them, you have to blow a hole in their wall to their cell with C4. Typical Metal Gear so far. However, the area isn't immediately accessible, so you have to navigate through a series of conveyor belts with box switching to find the right exit. Once you meet with them, now you have to get out of the base. However, instead of just having you backtrack, the base loses all power, meaning it's now pitch black and elevators and conveyor belts no longer work. Paths originally taken are no longer available. Your radar is also jammed, requiring you to navigate through the entire area with infrared vision. This makes the normally boring parts of the game where you're having to backtrack more interesting. nearly every section of the game has something different that keeps the whole game feeling fresh throughout. The one thing that is different about Ghost Babel is it's often lighter in action than your typical Metal Gear. There aren't any scripted shootouts with guards or chase sequences. Instead, the game features far more puzzles, making it a more tactical espionage puzzle game. There's a sliding door logic puzzle, a section where you have to navigate remote-controlled rockets through multiple sections in the right order to clear a path. Even some of the boss fights end up being more puzzle bosses than reflexes. I hate to admit it, but there were a few times where I was stumped because when Ghost Babel teaches you a mechanic, it expects you to use it for just beyond that scene, and it's reluctant to give away answers. Seriously, I was stuck on one level for way too long because I didn't realize you could shoot a missile outside of the building. The game expects you to think outside of the box as well as in it. The game itself is broken up into 13 different chapters, with each one being around 5 to 15 minutes long. This allows Ghost Babel to be played in fairly short bursts with good stopping points. Remember, the GBC was designed for playing on the go, such as a quick game before bed, during a bus ride, or most likely, you know.
It's coming out! Here it comes! Ugh. Still going. Wow! I didn't think that was possible. That's a record. Ugh. Will this even flush?
As a result, Ghost Babel ends up feeling more on the short side, with playtime ranging anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. Don't take this to mean that there's a lack of content though. Ghost Babel has an astounding amount of game in it for a handheld. After you beat the main story, you can go through each mission separately to get a better ranking, which is perfect for speedrunners out there. Or you can play through the special missions, which gives each level a different objective, such as playing through the level in reverse or searching for hidden emblems in the level. If you happen to be playing on the European version, completing these special missions also rewards you with more story as well. The game features over 80 VR missions with time attack modes for each of them. And to top it all off, there's a special battle mode using the link cable if you happen to have a friend with the game. Arguably, if we're talking strictly about gameplay, this game has just as much, if not more content than Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation. That is, if we're just talking about the gameplay. Fans of the series know it isn't just the gameplay that makes a Metal Gear game Metal Gear. They've always been games that push the boundaries of the hardware and blur that line between video game and cinematic experience. But this is a Game Boy game. There's no way it could possibly do that. Right? If you were expecting animated cutscenes like the one found in Cannon Fodder, you're most likely gonna be disappointed. While Ghost Babel does have cutscenes, they are decidedly less animated than ones found in even games like Ninja Gaiden. You can tell that the intent is there with dramatic angles and transitions, but compared to what you would expect in a Metal Gear game to have, it's surprisingly restrained. I mean, for crying out loud, the opening intro is only 12 minutes long. That's not to say the presentation is lacking. Ghost Babel is one of the best looking games on a handheld. Graphically, it might not seem all that impressive, but remember, you wouldn't be normally seeing the game like this, but rather on a screen that was about this. And even then, it mostly looked like this. While not as detailed, Ghost Babel is designed to be easily playable, with bright, contrasting colors to compensate for the Game Boy's lack of backlit screen. This was especially smart considering how small the pixels needed to be in order to give you an appropriate overhead view. There was even a lot of work put into the small details. Everything from the enemy's idle animations to the scan effect on the codec calls. Ghost Babel feels highly polished like a typical Metal Gear game. My only real complaint is with the inconsistent graphic style. The game sounds great too. Ghost Babel's soundtrack doesn't feature any songs that are recognizable from Metal Gear Solid, minus those used in the VR missions like Theme of Tara. But they fit the tone of the game extremely well, from haunting melodies as you stealth through bases, ranging from sad to dramatic for the game's story purposes. And they even do an excellent job at fading and entering at the right story moments. Unfortunately, a lot of the songs tend to focus more on function than form. As far as I can tell, there aren't any leitmotifs that tie the game together, and very few of the game's themes will stick with you. But what is there is very well done, if not a bit noisy at times. Another amazing thing is the level of detail they put into the sound design as well. It's crazy how they managed to give each character a voice.
Snake, there's a fork in the conveyor belt. The machine is automatically sorting cargo according to some system. Take a good look at the device.
Okay, no, I'm just kidding about that. They don't actually talk, but they did manage to make every text beep distinct and add a certain tone to it. And they even did an excellent job at matching the cadence of them speaking. All things considered, they put a lot of small details where they could, while not forgetting the limitations of the console that they were on. You could easily say that Metal Gear Ghost Babel is a solid entry in the series. In fact, it is arguably aged better than the game it was named after. But Metal Gear wasn't just about graphics or gameplay. The series is known for its storytelling, all in terms of cinematic approach, drama, narrative design, all of which have been facilitated by Hideo Kojima's direction. But can Ghost Babel tell a Metal Gear story, especially when Hideo Kojima wasn't really involved? That's right, Metal Gear Ghost Babel, while it was effectively produced by Kojima Productions, Hideo Kojima didn't take on his usual roles with the game. Kojima didn't direct or write the story. Instead, he's only credited as a writer for the original series, in this case Metal Gear, and is given a producer credit. Around this time, Kojima was heavily involved with the production of Metal Gear Solid 2. The only role he could have had during development in this game was given a thumbs up on certain inclusions, but given the game's narrative, there's a good chance he wasn't involved with that process either. For starters, the game isn't canon in the Metal Gear Solid timeline. I don't mean that in that it's a fan fiction that takes a little too much liberty with the characters or events. I mean the game completely disregards the events of Metal Gear Solid, nor does it build up to the events that would happen in Metal Gear Solid 2. Instead, the game acts like a sort of alternative timeline to the events after Metal Gear 2, set 7 years after Snake destroyed Metal Gear in Outer Heaven. Snake still retires to Alaska, but in this parallel universe, Liquid Snake doesn't lead an insurrection against the United States by stealing Metal Gear Rex. Instead, a separatist group known as the Gendra Liberation Front, or GLF, is fighting for their independence. In order to obtain it, they hijack a secret US military weapon during its transport, a weapon that is capable of a nuclear attack at anywhere in the world, codenamed Project Babel, also known as Metal Gear. Now I know some of you are probably disregarding Ghost Babel already, but hold on a sec. While it's true Kojima didn't have much, if any, real involvement, nor does it acknowledge the events of Metal Gear Solid, that doesn't make this any less of a Metal Gear game. In fact, despite the lack of Kojima, the people who worked on it would probably be some of the more defining staff of the series. In the director's chair was Shinta Norjiri, who had been with Kojima Productions since Police Knots. He would be part of the Metal Gear series until Guns of the Patriots, working mainly as a level designer and scripting. And that's probably the reason the level design is so good. It's also worth noting that he had directed the Metal Gear Acid games, another non-canonical entry into the series. Another key person was Akuya Nakamura, who for Ghost Babel led character design and artwork, and would serve as director for not only a few Metal Gear games, but also the Kojima-produced Boktai games. As a cherry on top, Nakamura was also the Rumple director for Metal Gear Solid and a few other games, which, if you're familiar with the series, you probably understand just how important that is. Also joining in is the legendary Norihiko Hibino, a man that would go on to later create the theme of Snake Eater, and composed several other Metal Gear soundtracks in addition to others. Interestingly, Ghost Babel would be the first game he would work on in the series. However, probably the most influential person on the staff was none other than Tomokazu Fukushima. Though Kojima tends to get a lot of credit for Metal Gear Solid's narrative, Fukushima had co-written Metal Gear Solid, Sons of Liberty, and Snake Eater. Simply put, he is responsible for some of the greatest stories in gaming. This is what makes Ghost Babel so interesting, because no one really had any idea just how much Fukushima was involved with the scripts for the games he was involved in. He could have simply served as an editor to Kojima, or he could be entirely responsible for some of the most memorable moments of the series. Since he had wrote the entirety of Ghost Babel, it's a good litmus test to determine what his contribution was to the series. The story, as mentioned before, involves an army of rebels seeking independence by hijacking Metal Gear and threatening to launch a nuclear attack on the United States if they don't pull peacekeeping efforts and declare the terrorist organization as an independent country. Snake is brought in because, well, obviously Metal Gear. But also the rebellion is taking place in a country known as Galud, located in Gendra, Africa, the place where Big Boss declared Outer Heaven. Well, at least in this timeline. Suspicious that there might be more going on because there's just too many coincidences, Snake agrees. We're not even past the intro and you can tell that this is a Metal Gear game through and through. It features a reluctant Snake not wanting to be involved until his old friend Colonel Campbell starts throwing out Snake's favorite two-word phrases, specifically Metal Gear and Outer Heaven, in order to convince him. Everything from how the character's parlance to the tone is delivered exactly how you would expect it to occur in a game, right down to Snake repeating the last words of someone else's sentence. You can practically hear David Hayter's delivery just by the writing alone. One thing that is noticeable is that the writing tends to be a bit on the laconic side. Characters often speak in short sentences and aren't nearly as verbose as they would be in other entries in the series. Codec scenes are infrequent and brief and not fully fleshed out as they could have been. This was most likely not intentional, but rather a limitation that was caused by the hardware. The Game Boy's small screen meant that only a few words could have been on it at a time and still be legible. Also, according to the cutting room floor, parts of the American version had to be cut out completely because they couldn't fit on the 16 megabit cartridge. They effectively had to save space wherever they could. In spite of that, the writing ends up still being really good. Important things such as personality and tone aren't lost due to the concise writing. It's just not as fleshed out as it could have been. But just in case the lack of dialogue gives you any doubt that this is a Metal Gear game, Ghost Babel introduces the game's group of villains, Black Chamber. They serve as the game's surrogate for Foxhound, right down to the codenames and combat gimmicks. When you defeat them, they even go on their long explanations regarding the origin of who they are, such as Slasher Hawk being shunned by his aboriginal tribe for being born an outsider, even though he had studied their taboos and culture. Or how Marionette Owl became a serial killer. When I was 12, Laura was murdered by some madman, a psycho, and I was the one who found her, scattered all over the field. Laura's white hands, thighs, dark entrails. That image was burned into the back of my eyes. Even now, in my sleep, every night. Man, it's a good thing that they removed the cigarettes from the game in order to earn that E for everyone rating, because no 5-year-old should miss out on the orgasmic death throes of a man as he self-immolates. Black Chamber wasn't just shoved in there for the sake of fulfilling an obligation. They actually have a fairly strong narrative reason to exist. One of the major underlying themes of Ghost Babel is Snake dealing with the events of Zanzibar. In this hypothetical sequel, Snake became somewhat of an international hero after the events of Outer Heaven, with everyone referring to him as the Legend. It isn't just a mention like it was in Solid either. Everyone seems to know of him or has heard of him. Snake retired, but his fame cast a light on Foxhound. And since it's hard to do top secret missions when everyone knows about you, they needed a group of people that could perform the functions of the Special Forces unit in secret. Black Chamber was born out of that need. However, Black Chamber was nearly wiped out by Foxhound, and their hatred of Snake grew to such a fervor that you later find out they had captured Metal Gear to lure him in so they could destroy him. Even Snake himself is confused by this needless need for revenge for something he wasn't even part of. But it turns out there's much more to it than that. The game features all sorts of twists, hidden motives, and double crossing that you could expect from the series. One of the things that needs to be pointed out within Ghost Babel's narrative is that it's very well grounded. Beyond just being the writer, Tomokazu Fukushima was also the series' researcher and justification. And it shows. There is no mention of pseudoscience the series is known for. There aren't any discussion about genetics or nanomachines. None of the characters have unexplained or particularly extraordinary powers. There aren't even any poisonous hamsters. Really, the most unbelievable thing is how Marionette Al has natural night vision and attacks by using puppets. But if that's the bar to an unacceptable break in reality in a Metal Gear game, that alone speaks volumes. With Ghost Babel, especially compared to later entries in the series, you really start to see the differences between Hideo Kojima's and Tomokazu Fukushima's writing. Fukushima tends to be very focused and nuanced. Each scene is concentrated on the plot or theme. That's not to say his plots aren't capable of getting a little crazy. The man wrote Snake Tales for MGS2 Substance, but there's always a sense of objectiveness in his writing. You get the feeling that Fukushima might have been the anchor to Kojima's creativity, which became more apparent after he left the series after Snake Eater. Fans noticed the shift in writing style, and even critically, the games never got the same praise for story as the original Metal Gear Solid trilogy. On all fronts, Ghost Babel is an incredibly well-made game. It looks absolutely amazing, it sounds great, and it plays extremely well. And I almost feel dirty for saying this, but it's probably the best written game in the series as well. Ghost Babel honestly has no right to be as good as it is. I would personally go as far to say that overall, Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color is easily one of the best games on the console. But that's almost universally agreed on. The real question is Ghost Babel the best Metal Gear game? And that is a little bit more difficult to answer. There could be a legitimate argument to why Ghost Babel is objectively the best game in the entire series, especially if you take into consideration the hardware it was built on. It manages to push the limits of the Game Boy Color but never overreaches. Whereas many games during that time tried to sell themselves on being technically impressive, Ghost Babel is technically competent, impressing where it needs to but focusing on being a good game first. Yet it has almost everything you expect from the series: stealth, sound, cinematics, and story. It's intimately aware of what a Metal Gear game is and does everything to live up to those expectations, and sometimes even exceeding them. While the game does have some slow moments and rough spots, that complaint can be leveraged against any game. Technically speaking, Ghost Babel is close, really close to being the best Metal Gear game. If we're speaking subjectively though, it's a bit harder to sell. Most people who enjoy this series don't necessarily like them because they're technically perfect games, but rather they enjoy the games because of their personality. And unfortunately, that is something that Ghost Babel genuinely lacks. While Hideo Kojima might not be the best writer, he is an excellent storyteller. He is able to create moments of narrative and gameplay that stick with you for decades. Psycho Manus and how he's able to read your memory card, and how you have to use the second controller port to beat him. That moment where the Colonel goes insane in Sons of Liberty, beating the end by moving your PlayStation 2 clock ahead a week. And I know it's easy to make fun of, and it's not necessarily even Kojima, but even the line, "I feel asleep," makes the NES game feel endearing. Each instance of these give the game a certain charm that makes it feel unique. Ghost Babel doesn't really have anything like that. There are a few moments that break the fourth wall, and a boss that counts the amount of enemies you killed, kinda like a precursor to the Sorrow, but for the most part the game doesn't do anything surprising with its story or gameplay. There isn't anything that sticks with you, nothing that makes you question your reality or change your outlook in the world. It even lacks that awkward humor or those surreal situations that you would normally find yourself questioning if you weren't so engrossed. Ghost Babel ends up being an amazing game, but this distinct lack of personality makes it feel not like a Metal Gear game, and that might be why it's so forgettable, not just by fans of the series, but by gaming history as well. However, Ghost Babel certainly didn't deserve to be forgotten. While its non-canon nature might have kept it from being referenced in the future games, it could have easily carried on with the series in its own way. The game even hints about there being a potential sequel, though nothing was ever really mentioned about it again. It's hard to tell if this was due to poor sales, or maybe because Kojima wanted more creative control of the series. But it was clear that Kojima Productions wasn't interested in revisiting the game, not even for a re-release. Which is a shame because Ghost Babel is also a pretty rare and expensive game. Wanting to play it for yourself most likely requires you going on a procure on-site mission of your own. Thanks, Nintendo. Any hope for an official continuation has died though. After making the Acid series, Shinta Nojiri had moved on to his own personal IP, Never Dead, which didn't do all that well and he left the company. And as mentioned before, Tomokazu Fukushima had quietly left the company after Snake Eater, for unknown reasons. Though he had worked in a minor role in some other games, he never returned as a writer. And to this day, fans are left wondering what happened to cause him to leave and where he went afterwards. Then, ultimately, Kojima himself would leave the company, meaning the end of the series as we know it. It's a shame because despite its issues, Ghost Babel deserved to be more than just a forgotten curiosity of the series. Maybe in some weird parallel dimension, Ghost Babel continued on and carried the legacy of the original series, acting as a sort of alternative version to the events in Solid. While it might not be the best Metal Gear game, it's definitely worth playing and discussing. Needless to say, Metal Gear Solid for the Game Boy Color passes the sobriety check. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video and want to see more, I wasn't kidding when I said I made a bunch of videos on Metal Gear Solid. If you want to know more about how Kojima tells a story, check out my video on Psycho Manus. Or you can check out my video on the narrative importance of a ladder. As always, you can subscribe for more content, and if you want to support the channel, you can check out my Patreon. A special thank you to all those who support the channel. I really couldn't do this without you. So until next time, this is SoberDwarf reminding you that gaining experience builds character.